Hello, everyone. Welcome to Labour CND PODCAST. I'm pleased to welcome back Francisco Dominguez, National Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, with an update on Venezuela since the US invasion in January. He was with us in November, warning that a possible invasion was on the cards, and how right he was. For those of you who don't know him, Francisco came to Britain 45 years ago as a refugee from Pinochet, Chile. He was head of the Latin American research group at the Middlesex University, and he writes for a number of Latin American publications and in progressive British publications as well. I'm guessing VSC Solidarity Campaign is taking up 110% of your time nowadays, Francisco. So welcome, and thanks very much for making the time available to do a Labour CND podcast with us.
Thank you very much, Carol, for inviting us again at Labour CND. Yes, we are extremely busy. It's very good to be busy doing a huge amount of solidarity work. I wish we didn't have to do it because of the circumstances, but I'm going to be back.
Okay, so let's get on with some of those questions. I think first off, since you and I last spoke back in November, and the US abducted President Maduro and Celia Flores, his wife, and a National Assembly delegate, there's probably a lot to report. They're now in the US detention, waiting trial, and I'll come back to that later. But the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what's life like for Venezuelans now? How are people getting by under a naval blockade and sanctions? How is the US presence making itself felt?
In terms of ordinary life, daily life, the situation is pretty normal. And the economy has recovered enormously. Last year, it grew by 8.5%. Now Venezuela is self-sufficient by 99, 97%. And the government, after that, the kidnapping of the president, they were able to restore immediately the constitutional continuity, and there is total normalcy at that level. The only difference is that there are demonstrations again and again and again, absolutely across the country, by all sorts of forces, social forces, particularly the people, demanding, they say, los queremos de vuelta, we want them back. And they mean President Maduro and Celia Flores. And what is not normal, and we might come back to that, is the pressure that has been exerted on the existing government, particularly those Rodriguez.
Oh, right. Okay. Delcy Rodriguez has been installed as the interim president, as I think most people on the podcast will appreciate. How's that working out? What sort of threats do you think Trump is holding over Delcy and the Bolivarian Revolution?
Well, on the day when the kidnapping took place and that took place, they reported Delcy Rodriguez, vice president at the time, Jorge Rodriguez, president of the National Assembly, and Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of the Interior, the three key people after Maduro in the structure there. They reported that they were contacted by the United States officials, exactly who they were, we do not know, and they were told that unless they did exactly what they wanted, which was, complete capitulation, they would be assassinated within 15 minutes. This is what they reported. So that is really over their heads absolutely every single time, especially after the kidnapping of the president. The United States now has demonstrated, certainly in the Trump administration, that is on steroids. It's really going absolutely everywhere. The the United States deploying military assets in Puerto Rico, in Panama, has a military base in Cuba itself. He's got 10 military bases in Colombia. He's got military bases in Guyana, and so on and so on. I mean, certainly in Florida, he's got more. And the fleet that was deployed, not all of it, but important part of the fleet is there. And now they deploy troops in Ecuador, ostensibly to fight against drug trafficking, but really to try to establish a permanent military presence there. So any move, any miscalculation on the part of the Delcy government might, prompt a very serious attack, which might take God knows which form. Trump relishes in the idea of killing people. Every time he mentions he has assassinated somebody, he relishes when it goes on television. So, and the people around him are as bad as him. So that is the actual condition. Therefore, the government is really doing all sorts of acrobatics, if that's the right position, daffing and diving to ensure that, whatever they say is extremely careful, very well crafted, and so on.
Oh, right. Okay. Let me ask you a follow-up, if I may. I've heard there are suggestions that Rodriguez has yielded to Trump's administration's demands. I also saw a Reuters report a couple of days ago that the US is preparing corruption charges against her. That doesn't tally. What's your take on that?
Well, this is part and parcel of the operation, is to keep exerting pressure to ensure that they want. I do not know the details, but I'm sure they want something specific. God knows what it might be at any particular point. And she's definitely not an asset. It's a real pity. The media is spreading this smear campaign against Delcy Rodriguez. I mean, concentrated particularly on her. And this is being picked up by some small groups, progressive forces, which are not very progressive in my view, if they think that. And we organized a webinar, just 2 days ago, where we had Nicolás Maduro Guerra, Nicolás Maduro's son, who is also a member of the National Assembly, who, explained exactly what it was. He said, under the circumstances, we have to do all sorts of things in order to ensure that we survive. We are surviving and we are determined to survive, but we have to understand it. The reason why I'm mentioning this is it will take absolutely everybody else in that government to betray President Maduro, including Delcy. This is not possible. So what she's doing, as the official voice of the government is she's got to make the statements, which are sometimes problematic or sometimes difficult, but it's totally understandable what she's trying to do. Otherwise, the military pressure, the military threat is always there.
Right. I see.
If I just she's been absolutely every single day, not every single day, but more or less every single day, we get information every day. She's been encouraging the working class and encouraging the people of Venezuela to mobilize, to demand, the release of the president. And this is encouraged by the TUC, the Venezuelan TUC, which is part of the system, as it were. And all of the ministers are doing the same. It would be impossible to imagine that she's the asset and everybody else is doing something else, or she's doing it what everybody else is doing in the circumstances. Otherwise, it made no sense. And she insists, I'm only the interim president. The legitimate, genuine president of Venezuela is Nicolás Maduro, and we want him back to take back his position. So that explains what it is. And then 3 days ago, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ivan Hill, went to the United Nations to denounce the sanctions system that the United States inflicted on Venezuela. So this is not a regime, it's not a government that is giving up. Quite the opposite. They are fighting as much as possible under very difficult circumstances with a missile pointed to their heads.
Thanks. That makes the situation much clearer. Let's move on then. I was at a meeting recently with a group of young people from South London who were reporting back on a delegation to Venezuela in December. And they were describing how society was organized, saying that Maduro enjoyed popular support, as did the Bolivarian Revolution. Do you think that is the case? What is morale like amongst the Venezuelan people?
Well, morale is very high. I know these reports directly because I know the people who went there. Morale is very high, and it was very high because the situation was being recovered quite dramatically. I mean, if you think about it, the United States asphyxiated the Venezuelan economy to such a degree that the Venezuelan government lost 99% of the revenues they used to get, and it was surviving with 1%. So therefore, a lot of people died. It was really terrible. Inflation was 1.5 million%. Now inflation is single digits. And Venezuela used to try to import food from everywhere. The United States blockaded that as well and bankrupted Brazilian and Mexican companies that were prepared to export food to Venezuela. So now it's 97, 99% self-sufficient. And life is getting much, much better. And suddenly there is impact. I think the attack is partly prompted, not exclusively, because there is the oil geopolitical dimension. It's partly prompted because the Venezuelans were able to defeat the sanctions regime, the maximum pressure applied by Trump in the first administration, in the second one. So that's why they went for it. They're hurt. They're really enraged. They're furious because, how is it possible that this is done to us? And they're not sure how to go about this. So the way they express it is by demonstrating. However, this is an important mention. The government hasn't stopped deepening the Bolivarian Revolution. There is civil brigades. We become are organizing elections to actually elect communes, which are the grassroots organizations, which actually are going to be the actual government in Venezuela. And there are about 50,000 of them in the country, like pretty well organized. I mean, it would not be possible to recover without this. This is being deepened. And then, everything else that goes with it, the militia, the people, the organization, women's participation, and everything else is continuing. So morale is higher at that level, but they want their president back, and they're insisting that this is very important for them. This is led particularly by the organized working class, which is the CSBT, which is the Venezuelan TLC.
That's very good. That's a relief to hear. So thanks for that. Let's move on to my final question, Francisco, which is what I mentioned right at the beginning. Can you please tell us what's happening to Maduro and his wife at present?
From what Nicolás Maduro Guerra, Maduro's son, told us the other day, President Maduro from New York, through possibly the lawyers and somebody else, is actually in constant communication or regular communication with the government in Venezuela, with people in Venezuela, because they report this back. He's in good spirits. He is quite prepared to fight back. When he was taken there on Thursday, he said something like, good morning in English, and smiled at the audience in the court. Everybody expected to be somebody completely demoralized, humiliated, desperate, demanding clemency, and they saw somebody completely different. And then he went on to say, I'm a decent man, I committed no crime. And then she went on to further say, I consider myself a prisoner of war. And that's the position. So the situation is that the United States will find it very difficult to justify the legal indictment against President Maduro and Celia Flores, because it is drug trafficking. Venezuela's contribution to drug trafficking, we know this already, is extremely small. I mean, Venezuela does not contribute. From the point of view of the government, there is no participation whatsoever. Zero. When it comes to fentanyl, it's zero as well. This is reported and registered by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. Venezuela, in fact, has been collaborating, participating very actively, vigorously combating drug trafficking. That's why there are problems. Most of the cocaine actually gets to the United States through the Pacific. So when it comes to drug trafficking, the chances of sticking it is very small, unless they organize a kangaroo court or some sort of frame up, which is totally possible. The second charge is narco-terrorism. What is the involvement in terrorism by Venezuela? There is no evidence whatsoever, none, zero. Cuba was put in the list of states sponsoring terrorism with no justification either. It's exactly the same playbook. So that is very unlikely to stick. And the indictment, the charge, the President Maduro was the head of the Cartel de los Soles, was dropped by the Department of Justice because they know it doesn't exist. So Barry Pollack, who is the lawyer, the defense lawyer of President Maduro, said they have no case, they have no reason. What is being done is completely illegal in international law, in US law, in Venezuela law. Any law you look at is completely illegal. So he said, I expect any day, I suppose he's being optimistic, any day of this time, any day, President Maduro will be released by the US authorities because they had no case. So there is one political point I want to make about this. I think Trump calculated by having the president as a trophy, he was going to capitalize politically with this. In fact, it's becoming a liability. The moment it becomes a liability, knowing him, he's likely to say, okay, fix it somehow. That doesn't mean to say it's going to be released. We have to organize an international campaign, which is already taking place to ensure there is huge pressure. I know we don't have a great deal of time, but there are a number of international associations and associations of lawyers of Brazil, Colombia, Central America, the United States, Europe, and so on, who have been making noises and issued statements saying this is completely illegal, who are prepared to help out. It's huge, it's gigantic, including over here, the Albanian Socialist Society of Lawyers. So, this is going to be quite significant. The question is to organize that international campaign. And Barry Pollack is very confident. Barry Pollack, for your audience, is somebody who led the team to defend Julian Assange. So he's in very good hands. However, the United States, and this is an indication of their weakness, the government of Venezuela is trying to pay the lawyers because they need to be paid. They are professional. And the United States is blocking the payment. This is an indication that, things are not going well for them. And then the first hearing was going to take place on the 17th of March. It's been postponed to the 26th, and possibly it's going to be postponed again and again and again to see what they do. And given that the situation of Trump is getting extremely difficult politically at home because of Iran and everything else he's doing, this case is either going, we have the possibility, I think, the forces of Progress International have the possibility of getting something substantially done. But that's the situation at the moment.
That sounds really positive. So international disapproval or stronger, it's sort of parallel to the way in which Israel's status has diminished as a result of the Gaza genocide. I take it that the information you're giving me is also getting through to the people of Venezuela, which I presume is very helpful from the point of view of maintaining morale. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is getting there. What is interesting is the level of opposition, intense opposition by the democratic, members of the Democratic Party establishment, which I think expect them to be so intense. It's very intensely opposed to this, Venezuelan business. What is a Venezuelan venture? You have people like Chris Murphy, who is member of the Intelligence Committee. You have people like Chuck Schumer, who is the member of the Democrats in the Senate. Hakeem Jeffries, the leading Democrat in the Congress, and so on. They're all completely opposed, and the polls indicate that between 71+% oppose the adventure in Venezuela. And that will include definitely people in the Republican Party. There are members of the Republican Party quite openly saying, voting to say this is not right. So we have at home in the United States domestically quite a strong opposition, and we have Venezuela, which is entire. We have the extreme right-wing opposition, which on the floor, it does not exist, ceases to exist completely. Maria Corina Machado has completely disappeared from, the radar. Nobody knows where she is. So they have no presence in Venezuela. The government of Venezuela is organizing the broadest possible united front to defend the nation, including with sections of the opposition inside Venezuela itself, to insist that Maduro and the wife, Silvio Flores, come back. So conditions exist possibly. The problem is Trump is going crazy, going absolutely everywhere, attacking militarily, everything. And this is a complication situation, but I don't think, Trump's offensive is sustainable politically at home and internationally. And that's our advantage. I suppose we can take advantage of that at that point.
I'd say that's really good news for all of us in Britain, and I presume from everyone who's watching from wherever. That's really good news that Trump is being pushed down. I mean, one of the things I noticed is in an American opinion poll that came out just after the bombing of Iran began. 1 in 4 Americans were dubious, were not supporting the actions of Trump. And I think and hope that there will be a sort of cumulative disapproval of the type you're describing in Venezuela, cumulative disapproval on many of his sort of war-inducing acts internationally. Thanks very much. Thank you very much indeed, Francisco. It is so good to get an update from someone who not only speaks the language and can follow what's going on in the country from that point of view, but also someone who's following it 24 hours a day and keeping in touch with everything. I hope that we'll be in a position to have you back in 2 or 3 months to say the situation is even more improved. Francisco Dominguez, Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, thank you very much for joining Labour CND podcast today.